Welcome back to my channel. I am your host, G.I. Wingnut. We are continuing with Atlantis and Lemuria by Rudolph Steiner, published originally in 1911. And we are up to chapter 5. So let's go ahead and get on into this book. Chapter 5, Women in the Third Root Race. The development undergone by women during the Lemurian era qualified her for an important role on Earth in connection with the beginning of the next Atlantean root race. Now, somewhere along the way, up through chapter 4, somehow we went from, or they went, with their story, non-corporeal, genderless entities. And now we have the development of the woman and the importance of her role. I'm wondering if this has to do anything with like the origins of some of the teachings like the Shekinah doctrine, the divine feminine. Anyway, moving on. This was ushered in under the influence of highly developed entities who were acquainted with the laws of the molding of races and who were capable of turning the existing forces of human nature into such courses as led the formation of a new race. Sounds to me like they ignored the first directive of the what is that, the Galactic Federation over there on Star Trek. The prime directive is do not interfere. Okay, moving on. Later on, a special reference will be made to these entities. For the present, suffice it to say that superhuman wisdom and power were immanent in them. They separated a small number of the Lemurian men and appointed them to become the progenitors of the subsequent Atlantean race. Eugenics, there it is again. Moving on. The place chosen lay in the torrid zone. The men of this little clan attained, under their guidance, the mastery of nature's forces. They were full of energy and knew how to wrest from nature treasures of many kinds. They knew how to cultivate fields and how to utilize their fruits. Through the training to which they had been subjected, compare previous chapter, they had become men of strong will. That's where memory came into play, was in the last chapter. Continuing. It was in woman, however, that the mind and the soul were developed. For it was in her that memory and imagination and all connected therein were found to have been already fostered. So, yes, it sounds to me like they're talking about a divine feminine. Continuing, the leaders to whom reference has been made brought about an arrangement of the little flock into small groups, and to women they entrusted the ordering and arranging of these groups. Women had acquired, by means of their memory, the faculty of utilizing for the future all of the experiences they had once known. That which had proved valuable yesterday was turned by them to present advantage. They were clearly aware that it would likewise be useful tomorrow. All right, I'm going to interject here. That plays into a philosophical concept that I utilize in my own life. The challenges I conquer today give me the tools I need to face, or the problems I solve today give me the tools I need to face the challenges of tomorrow. Anyway, but I don't give it a feminine aspect. It's just a philosophical thought for me. All right, moving on. The arrangements of the culture, of the communal life came thus from women. matriarchy, kind of like the Celts and some of the other European cultures before the Romans showed up. Moving on. Under their influence, the notions of good and evil were developed. Blame it on the women, just like in the book of Genesis. Moving on. Through their reflective life, they had acquired an understanding of nature. Out of their observations of nature grew the ideas according to which they guided the actions of men. The the womanly wiles, maybe? Moving on. The leaders arranged things in such wise that the willpower and the superabundant energy of men were ennobled and purified by the soul and the woman. Of course, all this is to be considered as at an elementary stage. The words of our languages are too apt to suggest ideas derived from contemporary life. Indirectly, through the awakened psychical life of women, did the leaders develop that of the men. In the above mentioned colony, the influence of women was therefore very great. They were consulted whenever it was desired to interpret the signs of nature, like the Oracle of Delphi, for example. Moving on. The whole mode of their psychic life was, however, still such that it was ruled by the quote-unquote secret psychic powers of men. To give an approximate, if not quite adequate, concept of this state, one might speak of the
Somnambulism. Somnambulism.
somnambulistic perception. All right, there we go. So let me start that sentence over again. To give an approximate, if not quite adequate, concept of this state, one might speak of a somnambulistic perception on the part of these women. They were sleepwalking. They were caught in a twilight, somewhere in between the physical world and the metaphysical. Shamanistic, one might say, even. Okay, moving on. The secrets of nature were revealed to them, and the impulses of their actions were imparted in a kind of higher dream state. Everything to them was the expression of spiritual powers and appeared in the form of psychic faculties and visions. They abandoned themselves in the mystic workings of their psychic powers. They were prompted to their actions by quote unquote inner voices, or by that which was told them by plants, animals, and stones, the wind and the clouds, or the rustling of the trees. Plants. Terence McKenna talking to mushrooms comes to mind. Moving on. From soul conditions of which a kind rose that which may be called human religion. The psychic element in nature and in human life came gradually to be reverenced and worshipped. Some women attained to special predominance because they were able to interpret from certain mysterious depths of phenomena of the world. So it came to pass that with these women, that which was within them transposed itself into a kind of nature speech. Like commanding storms, like Cat Kerr tries to do, or medicine women, maybe. Some that which some might call kitchen witches, perhaps. Um, there's a whole lot going on there. Moving on. For the beginning of the speech, or let's see. For the beginning of the speech lies in something akin to song. The power of thought converted itself into the audible sound. The inner rhythm of nature resounded through the life of wise women. People gathered around such women, and their song-like utterances were felt as an expression of higher powers. Thus did divine worship take its inception among men. So there's some teachings that are tangled up with the Rosicrucians, and thus did divine worship take its inception among men. Why am I thinking of Robin Bullock? Why? I don't know. All right, trying to move on. I'm trying to get through. Try to keep this video relatively short. So, moving on. It would be an error to consider that there was any sense in the spoken word at that time. Only the sound, tone, and rhythm were felt. No one had any aim other than just drawing strength into the soul from what was heard. The whole procedure was under the guidance of the higher leaders. They had inspired the wise priestesses with tones and rhythms in a manner which cannot be described here, and it was thus that women were able to affect the souls of men in such a way as to ennoble them. It may be said that it was altogether in this manner that the true soul life was awakened. The Akashic records reveal what are in this respect scenes of much beauty. One of these shall be described. We are in a wood close to a gigantic tree. The sun has risen to the east. Mighty are the shadows thrown by the palm-like tree across the cleared space around it. With her face to the east, in a state of exaltation, we discern a priestess on a seat prepared of curious natural objects and plants. Slowly and in a rhythmic cadence flow from her lips certain wondrous sounds which are repeated again and again. Okay, hang on. So we're talking about like maybe guttural chanting, like maybe throat chanting. Maybe not too dissimilar to Mongolian throat singing, perhaps. All right, moving on. Ranged in large circles, a number of men and women sit around her with dreamy faces absorbing inner life from the sounds. Still other scenes may be witnessed. At another place, arranged in like manner, a priestess chants in a similar way, but her tones have in them something more mighty, more powerful, and the men around her move in rhythmic dances. For this was the other method by means of which the soul entered mankind. The mysterious rhythms which man had caught from nature were imitated in the movements of his own limbs. Thus was it that man felt himself at one with nature and with the powers that ruled her. So, sounds to me like they're trying to describe something like the birth of tribal dancing, nothing too dissimilar to what might be seen in South America and some of the more primitive tribes, and or even Africa, or maybe some of the more ancient Chinese or Japanese traditional dances. Maybe other cultural ancient dances. Anyway, this is sounding a lot like an origin story of sorts. Moving on, the part of the earth on which was reared the germ of the coming human race was particularly adopted for this purpose. It was situated where the still agitated and stormy earth had more or less settled down. For Lemuria was greatly troubled by storms. The earth had not yet then reached its later density. The thin soil was everywhere undermined by volcanic forces bursting forth in smaller and greater streams. Mighty volcanoes were found nearly everywhere and continually exercised a devastating activity. In all their arrangements, men were accustomed to take this fiery agency into consideration. They even turned the fire to advantage in respect of their works and enterprises. The state of things was such that this natural fire could be turned to account in human labor, just as in the case today with artificial fire. It was the activity of the volcanic fire that also brought brought about the ruin of the Lemurian continent. The portion of Lemuria in which the root race of the Atlanteans was to appear had, it is true, a hot climate, but nevertheless it was exempt, on the whole, from subjugation to volcanic agency. Human nature could develop itself here more calmly and peacefully, and the more nomadic life of former times was abandoned, and fixed settlements increased in number. Okay, so we're working on an origin story of sorts. Continuing, one has to remember that this is a narrative. One has to remember, according to this story, that the human body was at this time still very plastic and flexible. It was still in a state of formation in keeping with man's inner changes. At a recent era, for instance, men were still quite different to their external appearance. The external influence of the country and the climate continued to affect their form. But in the specific colony of the body, but in the specified colony, the body became increasingly an expression of the inner psychic self. This colony contained, at the same time, a species of man who were advanced and of finer external form. It should be said that at the same time, It should be said that the true human form was created by what had been cloned by the leaders. Cloning. Eugenics and cloning. Huh. I've been hearing conspiracy theories about that sort of thing. Anyway, moving on. The work was certainly very slow and gradual, but the process began with the unfolding of the psychic life in man, and the still soft and plastic body adapted itself accordingly. It is a law of human development that the transforming influence of man on his physical body decreases with progress. Indeed, that physical body only acquired a fairly firm form through the development of intellectual power, and contemporaneously with the solidification of the stony, mineral, and metallic formations of the earth, which were connected with this development. For the Lemurian, and even in the Atlantean era also, stones and metals were far softer than they afterwards became. Please remember, this was written in 1911. Holy cow. It's really difficult to read. I hope you can listen to it easier than I'm able to read it. Moving on. This is not in contradiction with the fact that there still exist descendants of the last Lemurians and Atlanteans who even now display forms no less solid than those of the later human races. These remainders had to adapt themselves to the altered conditions surrounding them, and consequently became more rigid. This is precisely the cause of their gradual extinction. They did not mold themselves from within, but their less developed inner nature was forced from without into rigidity and thereby brought to a standstill. And this standstill is truly a retrogression, for even the inner life deteriorated because it could not live itself without the solidified external body. Ugh. Animal life displayed a still greater capacity for change. Reference will be made later on the kinds of animals present at the time of the earliest races, both as to their origin and also as to the appearance of their new forms of animals during the subsequent history of men. Suffice it here to say that the existing animal species were in a state of constant transformation and that new species continued to arise. Okay, two things. This sounds like an attempt to explain the fossil record that leans towards the whole concept of evolution, which I tend to subscribe to. And no, I do. I subscribe to evolution. And it also um, plays into some of with the kinds of animals. Some of what what's his name at the creation arc, Kent Hovind. Anyway, moving on. This transformation was naturally gradual. The reasons of the transformation lay, partly, in the change of domicile and mode of life. Animals had an extraordinarily quick capacity for adaptation to new conditions. The plastic body altered its origins with comparative quickness so that, after a longer or shorter time, the descendants of a particular species well nigh ceased to resemble their progenitors. It was also thus with plants, but in a more pronounced degree. The greatest influence on the transformation of man and animals was due to man himself, by his either instinctive bringing living beings into such surroundings that they assumed definitive forms or definite forms, or by attempting to produce changes by breeding. Hybridizing dogs, for example. Dachshunds being bred for hunting rabbits, Chihuahuas being bred to keep rats out of the house, for example. Moving on. The transforming influence of man on nature was, at that time, incalculably greater than it is the case at present, and this was especially the case by the colony described. For here, this transformation was guided by the leaders in a manner which was not realized by man. All done in secret. Moving on. So it came about that when men went forth and found the various Atlantean races, they took with them highly advanced knowledge as to the breeding of animals and plants. The growth of civilization was, then, essentially a consequence of the knowledge which they had brought with them. Nevertheless, it must be emphasized that these instructions were only instinctive in character, and in essence they still remained so among the first Atlantean races. Oh, so is this a hint towards the fallen ones, the Anunnaki, as some might call them, that brought this knowledge of a higher technology to modern man? Is this where we're seeing the origins from? I'm thinking it's possible. All right, so let's get this last paragraph read. The predominance of the woman's soul, already indicated, is particularly strong in the last Lemurian epoch and continues into the Atlantean era, when the fourth subrace was in preparation. In preparation? In preparation for what? Evolution? Ascension? What? Moving on. It must not, however, be thought that this was the case with the whole of mankind, but it holds true as regards that portion of the earthly population from which came forth at a later period the truly advanced races. This influence was most potent on all that was unconscious in or about man. The acquisition of certain habitual gestures, the subtleties of sense perception, the feeling for beauty, a good deal of the sensitive and emotional life common to men in general, emanated originally from the soul of woman. Oh, so men are brutes, huh? Women are the softer side of things. So moving on. It is not saying too much if we interpret the communication of the Akashic record to this effect. Quote, civilized nations have a bodily structure and a bodily expression as well as certain bases of the physical, psychic, or physically psychic life. Let me try that again. Quote, civilized nations have a bodily structure and a bodily expression as well as certain bases of the physically psychic life which have been stamped on them by woman. End quote. End of chapter. Kudos to you if you made it to the end of the video. If you have not yet and you appreciate my work, please do subscribe to my channel. Give me a thumbs up. And by all means, if you know somebody that you think might benefit from this work, please share it with them. Spread it around. The more people that know, the better things can be understood. That said, take care of yourself. Mind the sources that you utilize for your information. Use rational reasoning to filter things. And remember, your mental health matters. So if you need to take a break from studying and looking at this stuff, by all means, please do. And don't forget, water's pretty important. Hydrate, hippies, and everybody else as well. Catch you on the next video.